You lower yourself into a pit of human waste, waist deep. The stink hits you so hard your eyes water and your throat closes, but this is your job. Every single night you climb into London's cesspits with a bucket and a shovel, and you haul out what an entire neighborhood has deposited during the day. You are a Gong farmer, and in medieval England you were essential. You have probably never heard the word Gong used this way. In Middle English, Gong meant a privy, a toilet, an outhouse, a latrine trench. A Gong farmer was the person who emptied it. And the reason they worked at night was not because the work was embarrassing, it was the law. London's city ordinances, recorded in the letterbooks of the Corporation of London from the 13th century onward, prohibited Gong farmers from working during daylight hours. The smell was considered a public nuisance. The waste could not be transported through crowded streets while merchants and nobles were awake. So these men descended into darkness. They shoveled. They carried. They dumped the contents into designated waste pits outside the city walls or directly into the Thames. But here is the part that surprises most people. Gong farmers were not beggars. They were not outcasts. They were organized, licensed, and in some cases, surprisingly well paid. The London records show that Gong farmers could earn as much as skilled tradesmen. A single job cleaning a large cesspit might pay several shillings, enough to feed a family for weeks. The work was filthy, but it was in demand. Every house, every tavern, every monastery, every castle had waste that needed to go somewhere, and someone had to deal with it. This was the hidden economy of the medieval world. It ran on jobs you have never thought about. Take the Gong farmer's cousin in the royal court, the Groom of the Stool. This was one of the most intimate positions in the English monarchy. The Groom of the Stool attended the king during his most private moments. He carried the velvet-lined close stool, essentially a portable toilet, cleaned it, and maintained the monarch's personal hygiene. But the title was misleading. Over the centuries, this position evolved into one of the most powerful roles in the English government. The Groom of the Stool had direct, private access to the king. He managed the privy purse, the king's personal finances. He controlled who could enter the royal chambers. By the Tudor period, the Groom of the Stool was effectively the king's chief personal administrator. Sir Henry Norris held this position under Henry VIII, and he was one of the most trusted men in England. His proximity to the king's body gave him proximity to the king's power. The historian David Starkey, who has studied Tudor court records extensively, has argued that the Groom of the Stool was the most important man in the royal household after the king himself, all because someone needed to attend to a toilet. Then there were the jobs that operated at the boundary between life and death. In some English and French villages, if someone died suddenly, without time for last rites, without confession, without the sacraments, the community believed their soul was in danger. So a local person would perform the role of a sin-eater. Bread and ale would be placed on the chest of the corpse. The sin-eater would consume the food, symbolically absorbing the dead person's sins and transferring them onto himself. This gave the deceased a chance at heaven. The sin-eater took on their spiritual debt. This practice was documented in parts of Wales, the English Midlands, and rural France well into the 17th century, and accounts of it appear in antiquarian records from the 18th century. The folklorist Charlotte Sophia Byrne, writing in Folklore in 1892, recorded oral testimonies from Shropshire villagers who remembered the custom. The sin-eater was not a priest. He was usually a poor man, someone desperate enough to take food from the dead. The community needed him, but they also feared him. He carried the weight of other people's sins. Nobody wanted to stand too close. What about the people who collected leeches? Medieval medicine relied heavily on bloodletting. Doctors, barber surgeons, and monks believed that draining blood could restore the balance of the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To do this, they needed leeches, hundreds of leeches, and someone had to wade into ponds and marshes to gather them. Leech collectors, sometimes called leech gatherers, were a real occupation documented in medical and market records across Europe. They would walk into shallow water barefoot and wait. Leeches would attach to their legs and feet. The collector would peel them off, drop them into jars, and sell them to physicians and apothecaries. The work was painful. Each leech bite could bleed for hours and became infected frequently. Medieval medical texts, including the Tacuanum Sanitatis, a medieval health handbook based on an 11th century Arab treatise by Ibn Butlin, describe the properties of leeches and the importance of fresh bloodletting. The demand for leeches was constant, which meant collectors always had a market, but their bodies paid the price. Constant bites led to chronic infections, scarring, and sometimes serious illness. Then there were the fullers. If you wore wool in medieval Europe, and almost everyone did, someone had to clean and thicken the fabric after it was woven. Fullers did this by soaking woolen water mixed with human urine. Urine was collected in public containers placed on street corners and sold to fullers and tanners. The ammonia in the urine acted as a cleaning and bleaching agent. Fullers would stomp on the soaked fabric with their bare feet for hours, pressing and agitating the wool until it thickened and tightened. This was called walking the cloth. Economic historian John Munro, who spent decades studying the medieval textile industry at the University of Toronto, documented how fulling was a critical step in wool production and one of the most labor-intensive processes in the medieval economy. Fulling mills powered by water eventually replaced some of the manual labor, but for centuries, fullers stood in vats of urine and stomped. The smell in a fulling workshop was overwhelming. Medieval towns often required fullers to work outside the city center. Not all weird medieval jobs involved filth. Some involved silence. An anchorite or anchoress was a person, often a woman, who chose to be sealed inside a small stone cell attached to the wall of a church. A door was bricked shut. A small window allowed food to pass through and permitted the anchorite to look out at the altar during Mass. A second small window might allow conversation with visitors seeking spiritual counsel. But the anchorite never left for the rest of her life. This was not punishment. It was considered one of the most sacred vocations in medieval Christianity. The anchorite had voluntarily withdrawn from the world to devote herself entirely to prayer. The ritual of enclosure, called immuring, was performed by a bishop, and it was treated almost like a funeral. The anchorite was considered dead to the world. The most famous anchoress in English history is Julian of Norwich, who was enclosed in a cell attached to St. Julian's Church in Norwich in the late 14th century. She wrote Revelations of Divine Love, considered the first book written in English by a woman. She never left her cell. Historian Eileen Power, in her landmark studies of medieval women and religion published in the early 20th century, noted that anchorites occupied a strange social position. They were revered but also pitied. They were holy but also hidden. Some women chose this life willingly. Others were pressured into it by families who could not or would not support them. The cell offered certainty, a guaranteed roof. Regular food passed through the window. For a woman with no inheritance, no marriage prospects, and no convent willing to accept her, the anchor hold might have seemed like the only option that did not end in begging. And then there was the medieval executioner. You might imagine this as a feared figure, a man of power. In reality, executioners were social pariahs. They lived outside the city walls. They could not eat in taverns, attend church freely, or touch other people without restriction. Their children were often forbidden from marrying into respectable families. The profession was hereditary in many regions. Once your father was an executioner, you were marked. But the job required skill. A good executioner was expected to sever a head in a single blow. This took practice, technique, and a steady hand. Botched executions caused public outrage. In Germany, Meister Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg kept a detailed diary of his career from 1573 to 1618. Documenting over 360 executions and numerous punishments. While Schmidt is post-medieval, his records reflect traditions and practices that had been refined over centuries. Executioners were also called upon to torture prisoners for confessions, to flog criminals publicly, to brand them, and sometimes to perform minor surgeries. They were, in a grim way, the closest thing many towns had to a surgeon. The real picture of medieval work is nothing like the fantasy. There were no clean job titles, no neat categories. A peasant woman might spend her morning milking cows, her afternoon spinning wool, her evening brewing ale, and her night emptying the family's cesspit. A monk might farm, copy manuscripts, brew beer, tend a hospital, and dig graves, all in the same week. The medieval world did not separate work into specialties the way we do. It demanded everything from everyone. What is strange is how many of these jobs still exist in modern form. We still have sanitation workers who handle what society discards. We still have medical professionals who work with substances most people find revolting. We still have people whose jobs require them to live apart or endure social stigma. The Gong farmer has become the sewage plant operator. The leech collector has become the medical-grade leech breeder. Yes, they exist. The sin eater has no direct equivalent, but the therapist who absorbs other people's pain for a living might come closest. You do not think about the person who cleans your sewage until your toilet breaks. Medieval people did not think about the Gong farmer until the cesspit overflowed into the street. In every age, the people who handle the worst parts of keeping a society running are the people society sees last. And the next time you complain about your job, consider this. At least no one is asking you to stomp on wool in a vat of urine while a church bell marks the hours of your shift. Or maybe they are. Medieval people would not have been surprised.